Hello everyone, I welcome you back to our series with NLTI where we are covering some basic concepts of NLSAT, and in today's session we are looking at dealing with some difficult reading comprehension passages. Generally in NLSAT, most of the passages that you'll be going through, they're somewhat easy to understand. There are about 8 passages that come in this paper, but at times when you're preparing for the paper or there is a reasonable fear in students that what if there is a difficult passage, and students have at times felt that some passages were difficult. So what do you do when you have to deal with a difficult reading comprehension passage? So this session will help you deal with those kind of situations where you feel stuck somewhere in the passage or you're not able to make sense of it. Also, it is worth noting that what's difficult will again depend on student to student. One set of students might feel it's a reasonably easy passage, while others might find it as difficult. So I guess it's really comes down to how one views a passage, but we'll nonetheless cover some handy tips for you as to what you should do when you are facing a passage which you feel is difficult and you are unable to understand the contents of it. So the focus in this session is to basically give you some tips and tools to navigate through those kind of passages where you're feeling that you're not exactly sure about what this passage is saying, or anywhere you feel stuck, then what should you really do? Because it does happen to a lot of students that they feel that they are stuck somewhere in a passage and they're unsure of how to proceed ahead. So let's start with some basic clarifications that you should keep in mind before you actually deal with these kind of passages. You need not ascertain the meaning of each and every word. What I mean by this is that a passage sometimes may not be difficult, but there could be some difficult words in the passage. For example, a passage might use a word like epoch. Now, many of you may not know the meaning of the word epoch, but in the passage, if you read this word, some students will worry or they might feel panic because of they are not able to understand a word. It's okay if there are a few difficult words in the passage. My suggestion is skip those words and move on to the next word and then continue reading your passage. Do not get stuck on that passage because there is a certain word that you're not able to understand. At least in NLSAT, a lot of your passages will only be difficult because there are few difficult words used in it. So maybe there are 3-4 difficult words in a passage. If you do not know the meaning of them, it's unlikely that in the exam, by thinking more about it, you'll somehow be able to understand their meaning. So the more wise and prudent strategy is to just simply move on to the next word. Because what will help you do is that we need to only broadly understand what the passage is saying. The objective of reading a passage is not that you understand each and every single line and word in that passage. Our objective is to generally understand what the passage is trying to say. So long as we understand that and we get a gist of the passage, we're good to go, because eventually we'll have to look at the questions and answer those questions. The test is not of how well have you understood the passage. So that's why we only need to know broadly what the passage is stating, and then we can revert to the passage depending on what a question asks. But if at any point you feel that there is a difficult word in front of you and you do not know its meaning, do not panic. It's okay to leave that word and keep on reading with the passage. No passage will be difficult in its entirety, only some parts will. So also keep that in mind. No passage in the last 4 iterations of NLSAT since 2022 all the way till 25, there hasn't been any passage which is difficult in its entirety. So there can only be a few parts of that passage that could be difficult. So if you're sometimes stuck with such a passage, keep in mind it's not difficult in its entirety. There are only a few parts of it that you need to address. So do not worry or panic thinking that it's a very difficult passage. It is fine to skip the difficult bit so long as we are broadly understanding what the passage is demanding. So long as we are understanding what the passage is saying broadly, that's enough. It's not the case that you need to understand the meaning of each and every single word and line in that passage. Now we should go on to what you should do if in case you actually see such a passage which is difficult, and what should your approach be. First is use context clues. So often the meaning of a difficult word can be inferred from the surrounding sentences. So look for synonyms, antonyms, or explanations that provide context. So for example, you're reading a passage, okay? First line, second line, third line. Somewhere in the first line, a difficult word comes, okay? In the third line, again, a difficult word comes. Most students will tend to focus too much on these 2 words and forget everything else what is written in the passage. My suggestion here to you is that try to gauge the meaning of those other lines, and through that see what these words can possibly mean. So what we are basically doing with this strategy is that we try to infer the meaning of the words through the surrounding words and sentences. Because of course we cannot exactly know what those words mean if we are not aware of them, but we can try to come close or infer possible meaning of these words by reading the other portions of the passage. So if you're stuck in a passage at any point, try to separate that difficult portion and then read the other bits and try to gauge the meaning of difficult ones by reading the other portions of the passage. That will certainly help you continue by reading your passage and also not waste a lot of your time. Focus on overall comprehension. Do not let the vocabulary distract you from the main point. Prioritize understanding the central message of the passage. So long as we know what the passage is broadly about, it's going to be fine for us, because eventually when we'll go to the questions and come back to the passage, we'll only have to look at the relevant or specific portions of the passage. You need not know every single part of the passage to be able to answer your questions. Look for how the author uses evidence or reasons to back up the main idea, even if you don't understand every word. So the idea is that every author in the passage is likely going to make some argument or some points. We need to know what those points are and what those arguments are. And if we understand those main points and arguments, that's enough for our purposes. We need not know exactly every single detail that author has mentioned in the passage. I know it sounds like a very counterintuitive strategy to most of you, that how do we just skip some things in the passage. That's the case because we're trying to attempt an exam here. We're not trying to understand a whole passage. Our focus is to just simply understand what this passage is saying broadly. The other thing you can do is that now let's say that the whole passage has left you a little scrambled. You're still very unsure of what this passage meant, or you just have understood roughly a little bit of what this passage is trying to say. You felt that it was a difficult read. I would say that you can read the questions first. Because what happens is that many a times, let's say this is a passage and this particular line was a difficult one. Okay? You did not understand the meaning of this line. You tried to read it again. It still did not come to you. Continue reading your passage. Go down to questions. There is a chance that the question itself may not ask anything related to this specific sentence. This happens a lot of times. Students think that every single line in a passage is important, but the lines are as important as the questions make them. So if there is a question which does not even ask you anything based on that specific line of the passage, then we can simply ignore it as well. So that's why if you're too unsure, then you can go down to the questions and read them first. That could help you understand the passage or help you realize that the portion of the passage is not very important from question answering point of view. So that's why even this goes for also if let's say there is a paragraph in a passage. These are 4 lines which you think are very difficult to read. Go down to the questions first. See if the question is even testing you on the knowledge of this paragraph. If it doesn't, then it's anyway not very useful for you. And if it does test you on the knowledge of this, then you can specifically focus on that one question alone. You need not disturb your whole time management for the entire question set and the whole passage. The last advice is that if you face a very difficult paragraph in the passage, break it down, divide longer passages into smaller chunks, read one paragraph at a time, pausing mentally to summarize the main point before moving on. Very simply, what this suggestion is trying to ask you to do is that if there are, let's say, these 4 lines or this one paragraph which is very difficult for you, slow it down, break it down into different chunks. Let's say you broke it down into 4 parts. And then try to see what each and every single part is saying and then summarize it. Now, why did I say to summarize it? The reason is very simple. When you actually break down a piece of information and you're trying to summarize it, you force yourself to gain some meaning out of it. You'll ask yourself, what can these 4 lines possibly mean? I have broken them down into 4 components and this is what I possibly infer out of it. And then you write it down. Once you write it down, you actually force yourself to gain some interpretation from that difficult paragraph. So that way you will know exactly what this paragraph is saying by putting some kind of summary. Now, it's possible that your summary may be slightly inaccurate, maybe slightly off the mark because you were not able to understand the paragraph. But at least you will be able to gain some meaning from that paragraph. Even if you're not exactly there, you will be somewhat close because you try to break it down and you try to see what it can possibly mean. So even that much is enough, I would say, and is helpful in a strategy way when you are actually attempting the difficult passages. Don'ts, and these are also very important. Don't obsess over every word. I have already emphasized upon this quite a bit in this session. If a word stumps you, you try to understand its general meaning from the context. You can often grasp the main idea without knowing the exact definition of every word. As and when you'll read more and more number of passages in order to prepare for this exam, you'll realize that to understand a passage, you need not know the meaning of each and every single word. So you can understand the meaning of the passage by just generally reading the broad contents of it and by going through the passage itself and not getting bogged down into every single word that goes. So do not obsess over it. It's the biggest single reason why people find passages difficult. There are no other reasons. Even the assessors and the examiners are vigilant of the fact that they do not give you an overly difficult passage, because if they do that, it's likely going to be one which makes things too confusing for students. So that's why keep in mind, it's usually going to be the case that a whole passage is not going to be difficult in its entirety. Move on and come back. If a word is crucial or if any particular paragraph or a sentence in a passage is too difficult, take a mental note and come back after you first pass through the passage. Sometimes understanding the context of the whole passage can help you decipher the meaning of a specific word. As I said, sometimes as we are moving through a passage, we may not know the exact meaning of that specific sentence or a word or a paragraph. So for example, if this is a whole passage, a passage starts from point A and it goes all the way to point Z. When you start reading as a candidate from this point and you find something difficult over here, it will appear way more difficult when you're initially going through it, because you do not know much about that passage. You do not know what this passage is about. So due to the lack of enough information about the passage, a difficult word may appear excessively difficult. What you should instead do is, you go through this passage, you keep reading it, and once you reach point Z, you will get some context. Then you'll know, okay, this passage is about, let's say, women's rights in a country, in a sub-Saharan country. This context will help you gain the meaning of these difficult portions. So that's why it's important that you cover the passage in its one go and then come back to those bits which you felt were difficult or which you felt were a little challenging for you to grasp. So that's why the most important suggestion is that you keep moving on. Do not get stuck somewhere and go all the way to the end, and you'll get some context about the passage. And then you can perhaps go back to these portions to understand their meaning. So that is there all to discuss when you are faced with a difficult reading comprehension passage and how you should navigate your path in such a situation. Thank you all for watching. I hope this session was helpful for you, and stay tuned for more content from NLTI.